Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. Imagine paying your HOA a full year in advance, hiring premium landscaping, setting up cameras, doing everything by the book. And they still declare your home abandoned. Then you check the footage and realize they're not fining you. They're selling it. But here's the question. How far did she really plan to take this? I never thought I'd be the guy posting one of these stories, but here we are. This happened about 2 years ago, and I'm still processing just how insane the whole situation got. Let me start with some background. I work as a specialized engineering consultant, and most of my projects are domestic, but every few years I get offered contracts that are too good to pass up. In early 2022, I got approached about an 8-month gig in Singapore working on a massive infrastructure project. The pay was incredible, and honestly, I needed the change of pace after a rough divorce the year before. I live in one of those planned communities where every mailbox looks identical and the HOA has opinions about everything. My house is actually one of the nicer ones on the block, which becomes relevant later. The HOA president is this woman I'll call the president. She's one of those people who treats the HOA like her personal kingdom and has way too much time on her hands since her kids moved out. The president had always made these weird comments about my house, things like how it was such a shame that a beautiful family home was just sitting there with one person rattling around in it. She'd say stuff like that house deserves a family, not someone who's never even there. I travel for work pretty regularly, so I guess she noticed I wasn't around much even before the Singapore job. Before leaving for Singapore, I did everything by the book. I'm talking obsessively by the book. I paid my HOA dues 12 months in advance, which came to about $3,600. I set up automatic payments for all utilities and made sure everything was bulletproof. I hired this premium landscaping service that charges almost twice what most companies do, but they guarantee your lawn will look perfect even if you're gone for months. I wanted zero excuses for anyone to complain about my property. I also installed a bunch of smart home stuff before leaving. Smart doorbell, smart thermostat, smart locks, the whole setup. Plus, I had these outdoor security cameras that run on solar panels with their own cellular connection, completely separate from my home internet. I figured I could keep an eye on everything remotely and maybe catch any package thieves or whatever. The first 3 months in Singapore went great. I'd check my cameras occasionally, saw the landscaping guys doing their thing, mail piling up normally, everything looked fine. The smart devices were all working perfectly and my house looked better than most of the others on the street. Then in month 4, things started getting weird. First, my smart doorbell went offline. I figured maybe the internet was down temporarily, no big deal. But then 2 days later, my smart thermostat stopped responding. That got my attention because those things are pretty reliable. When I tried to log into my home internet router remotely, nothing. Complete blackout. I called my internet provider from Singapore, which was a nightmare with the time difference, and they told me the account had been closed. Not suspended for non-payment, closed. Someone had called in claiming to be the authorized property manager and requested immediate service termination. That's when I checked my outdoor cameras, the ones on the separate cellular connection. What I saw made my blood run cold. The president was standing on my front porch with some contractor guy, and he was drilling out my locks. Not picking them, not using some master key, actually drilling them out with a power drill. There was a realtor sign on my front lawn. Not a generic for sale sign, but one of those fancy boutique realty firm signs that cost serious money. I watched this happen live from Singapore at 3 a.m. local time, and let me tell you, that was a surreal experience. I immediately called the president. Part of me expected her to panic when she heard from me, maybe claim it was all some misunderstanding, but when she answered the phone, she was completely calm, smug even. She told me that since I had abandoned the property and violated community bylaws regarding occupancy requirements, the HOA had placed a lien on the house and initiated something called a receiver's sale to recover costs of emergency maintenance that they'd supposedly done. I asked her what emergency maintenance, since I could see on my cameras that my lawn looked perfect and nothing was wrong with the house. She said they'd had to hire contractors to address various code violations and safety issues. When I pointed out that I'd paid my dues a full year in advance and hired professional landscaping, she said the landscaping wasn't up to community standards and they'd had to intervene. Then she said something that still makes me angry thinking about it. She told me not to bother coming back, that the legal fees to fight this would cost more than my equity in the house, and I should just move on with my life. The way she said it, so casual and dismissive, like she was doing me a favor by stealing my house. I didn't yell at her, I didn't threaten her, I just said okay and hung up. Then I called my neighbor 2 doors down, an older guy who's always been pretty straight with me. He confirmed what I suspected. The president had been telling people that I'd abandoned my property and disappeared overseas. She was claiming the HOA had tried to contact me for months about various violations but couldn't reach me. But here's the really messed up part. My neighbor told me the president had been showing my house to her nephew, this guy in his 30s who apparently flips houses for a living. She'd been talking about how it was going to be a distressed sale, a real steal for someone who knew how to work the system. My neighbor also mentioned that the president had filed some kind of police report claiming my house was being used by transient squatters. She'd apparently told the cops that unknown people had been seen coming and going from the property, and she was concerned about safety issues in the neighborhood. The transient squatters she was talking about? That was me, the actual homeowner, from before I left for Singapore. I spent the next week making phone calls and doing research. Singapore is exactly 12 hours ahead of my time zone, so I was making calls to lawyers and government offices in the middle of the night. What I discovered was that the president had massively screwed up. Our state has extremely strict laws about property liens and foreclosure sales. You can't just decide someone abandoned their house and sell it. There are specific notification requirements, waiting periods, court filings. The whole process is heavily regulated. The HOA hadn't followed any of those procedures. They just decided to take my house and were trying to rush through what they called a quiet title action by claiming they couldn't locate the owner. But I wasn't missing. I was in Singapore on a work contract with a paper trail longer than a CVS receipt. I hired 2 firms back home. First was a real estate attorney who specializes in what he calls lien stripping, basically defending against fraudulent property seizures. Second was a private security company, the kind that does executive protection and corporate security, not just shopping mall guards. The security firm was expensive but worth every penny. I gave them power of attorney for property management and had them coordinate with my attorney. While the HOA board was having their monthly community meeting arguing about whether tulips or daffodils should be planted in the common areas, my security team was at my house. They changed the locks again, installed new cameras, and put up professional signs that said no trespassing, armed response, authorized personnel only. But the legal strategy was the really beautiful part. My attorney filed something called a lis pendens on every single HOA board member's house. It's basically a legal notice that says the property is involved in pending litigation and can't be sold or transferred until the case is resolved. Suddenly, all 5 board members couldn't refinance their mortgages or sell their homes without dealing with my lawsuit. The attorney also filed complaints with the State Real Estate Commission about the president's nephew. Turns out showing properties and negotiating sales without a license is illegal even if you're related to someone on the HOA board. Who knew? But I wasn't done. I told my security team to let the president schedule one more showing of my house. I wanted her to bring her nephew by for what she thought would be their final walkthrough before closing the deal. The security team had instructions to let them in, not interfere, just document everything. But I had them leave a little welcome gift on my kitchen counter. When the president and her nephew walked into what they thought was their stolen property, they found a formal legal summons waiting for them. Not just a civil lawsuit, but criminal charges, grand theft, breaking and entering, fraud, the whole menu. The look on their faces when they realized they were being recorded by my new camera system was apparently priceless. See, when the president filed that police report claiming my house was occupied by transient squatters, she'd committed perjury on a government document. When she told the utility companies she was the authorized property manager, that was wire fraud. When she changed the locks and staged the house for sale, that was breaking and entering plus theft. The paper trail was absolutely damning. Every phone call, every document, every lie she'd told was carefully documented by my attorney's investigator. The HOA board panicked completely when they found out about the criminal charges. These were suburban homeowners who'd never even gotten a speeding ticket, and suddenly they were looking at potential jail time because of the president's schemes. Within a week, 4 of the 5 board members voted to remove the president from her position and distance themselves from her actions. They hired their own attorney, who basically threw the president under the bus and claimed the rest of the board had no idea what she was doing. The receiver's sale was declared null and void by the court. The judge was not happy about the HOA's creative interpretation of property law. In his written opinion, he said the HOA had shown a shocking disregard for basic legal procedures and due process rights. But the civil settlement was where things got really satisfying. My attorney sent the HOA a demand letter laying out exactly what it was going to cost them if we went to trial. Property damage, legal fees, emotional distress, lost income from having to deal with this mess while trying to work overseas, punitive damages for their clearly fraudulent behavior. The number was in the low 6 figures. The HOA's insurance company took one look at the case and basically told them to settle immediately. Fighting it would cost more than paying me, and they were obviously going to lose at trial. The final settlement included payment for my flights back from Singapore, a full year of free HOA dues, $50,000 in damages, and an additional $15,000 to cover the cost of having my house professionally cleaned and repainted after they'd been tramping through it for weeks. Oh, and they had to pay for upgraded security systems and landscaping to make up for the disruption to my property. The president ended up losing everything. She had to sell her house to pay her legal fees and the personal liability that wasn't covered by HOA insurance. Turns out when board members go rogue and commit crimes, the association's insurance doesn't protect them. Her nephew got investigated by the State Real Estate Commission and lost his contractor's license. He'd been operating without proper permits for years, but nobody looked too closely until my case brought him to their attention. I came back from Singapore 3 months early because of all this drama, but honestly, it was worth it to see the results. The new HOA board couldn't apologize enough. They sent me a formal letter acknowledging that my property had always been in full compliance with community standards and that the previous board's actions were completely unauthorized and illegal. The funniest part was coming home to find my house in better condition than when I'd left it. The HOA's insurance had paid for professional cleaning, fresh paint, and upgraded landscaping. My lawn looked like something out of a magazine, and my house was spotless. But the best part was how the neighborhood treated me after everything came out. Before this happened, I was just the quiet guy who traveled a lot for work. Now I'm the guy who single-handedly took down a corrupt HOA board from halfway around the world. People who had never spoken to me before were suddenly very friendly. The new board members go out of their way to be accommodating about everything. Nobody complains about my travel schedule anymore or makes comments about how my house deserves a family. I installed even better security systems with the settlement money, and I made sure everyone in the neighborhood knew about them. Not in a threatening way, just making it clear that my property is very well monitored now. The president moved out of state after selling her house. Last I heard, she was living in some apartment complex and working retail. Her nephew ended up having to close his house flipping business and get a regular job in construction. Meanwhile, I'm still doing consulting work, still traveling when good projects come up, and my house is still one of the nicest on the block. The difference is that now everyone knows what happens when you try to mess with it. I kept detailed records of everything throughout this process, and my attorney said it was one of the most clear-cut cases of HOA overreach he'd ever seen. He actually uses my case as an example in seminars he does for other attorneys about property rights and HOA law. The whole experience taught me a lot about the importance of documentation and having good legal representation. It also taught me that sometimes the best response to bullies isn't to get angry, but to get methodical. The president thought she could take advantage of someone who was out of the country and couldn't fight back immediately. She figured by the time I found out what was happening, it would be too late to do anything about it. She was wrong. But you know what the craziest part of this whole story is? I'm not even done telling it yet. Because about 6 months after everything was settled and the dust had cleared, I discovered there was a whole other layer to what the president had been planning. And that's when things got really interesting. See, my neighbor who had kept me informed during the initial crisis mentioned something that didn't make sense at the time. The president had been asking around about property values in the neighborhood and whether anyone else might be interested in selling. I didn't think much of it then because I was focused on getting my own house back. But later I realized she hadn't just been targeting me randomly. This was part of a much bigger scheme. The president had been systematically identifying properties in the neighborhood where the owners traveled frequently for work or had other reasons to be away for extended periods. She was basically building a list of targets for future acquisition attempts. My house wasn't the first one she'd tried this with, it was just the first time she got caught. Remember that police report she filed claiming my house was being occupied by transient squatters? Well, it turns out she'd filed similar reports about 3 other properties in the neighborhood over the previous 2 years. In each case, she'd claimed the homeowners had abandoned their properties and that there were safety concerns. In each case, she'd convinced the other board members that the HOA needed to take emergency action to protect property values. The difference was that the other homeowners had been successfully intimidated into giving up. They'd been scared off by legal threats and the cost of fighting the HOA. They'd sold their houses at below-market prices just to make the problem go away. And guess who had been helping those distressed sellers find buyers? The president's nephew, of course. This wasn't just about stealing my house. It was about running a long-term scam using the HOA as legal cover for what was essentially a property theft ring. The president would target vulnerable homeowners, manufacture violations and emergencies, then use her position on the board to authorize liens and forced sales. Her nephew would swoop in with below-market offers, flip the properties, and they'd split the profits. They'd been doing this for at least 2 years before they picked the wrong target. When I found out about this pattern, I contacted the other homeowners who'd been victimized. 2 of them were willing to join a class action lawsuit against the president and her nephew. The 3rd had moved out of state and didn't want to get involved, which I understood. But 2 was enough. My attorney was practically salivating when I brought him this information. What had started as a simple property dispute was now a RICO case involving mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and systematic racketeering. The federal government doesn't mess around with organized fraud schemes, especially when they involve real estate. The FBI got involved, and suddenly this became a much bigger deal than anyone had expected. The president and her nephew were arrested 6 months after my original case was settled. They were charged with multiple federal crimes related to their property theft scheme. During the investigation, agents found records showing they'd stolen over $400,000 in equity from neighborhood homeowners over a 3-year period. They'd targeted military families, elderly residents, and people like me who traveled frequently for work. The president kept detailed notes about potential targets, including personal information about residents' work schedules, family situations, and financial status. She'd been treating the HOA like her personal intelligence agency. Her nephew had been using the stolen properties as collateral for loans to fund other real estate deals. He'd basically built his entire business on houses that had been fraudulently seized from their rightful owners. Both of them ended up pleading guilty to federal conspiracy charges. The president got 3 years in federal prison. Her nephew got 5 years because he had a prior conviction for mortgage fraud in another state. The restitution payments alone bankrupted both of them. They had to liquidate everything they owned to pay back the victims, and even then it wasn't enough to cover all the damages. But here's the part that really shows you how deep this scheme went. During the federal investigation, agents discovered that the president had been in contact with HOA board members in other communities, sharing strategies for identifying and targeting vulnerable homeowners. This wasn't just happening in our neighborhood, it was happening in planned communities across 3 different states. The FBI ended up investigating more than 20 HOA-related property theft cases connected to the president's network. Some of these cases went back 5 years or more. My attorney said that if I hadn't fought back so aggressively and documented everything so thoroughly, this scheme might have continued for years without being detected. The federal judge who sentenced the president said her actions represented a complete betrayal of the trust placed in HOA board members, and that she'd used her position to prey on vulnerable homeowners in a way that was both legally sophisticated and morally bankrupt. I testified at her sentencing hearing about the impact her actions had on my life and work. I talked about the stress of discovering your home had been stolen while you were overseas, the cost and difficulty of fighting back from another country, and the violation of privacy that came with having strangers moving through your personal space. But I also talked about how satisfying it was to take down someone who thought they could get away with stealing from people who couldn't fight back immediately. The president tried to give some sob story about financial difficulties and making poor decisions, but the judge wasn't buying it. He pointed out that this was a systematic criminal enterprise that had victimized multiple families over several years. When she was led away in handcuffs after sentencing, I felt like justice had finally been served. The civil settlements from the class action lawsuit meant that all the victims got their money back plus damages. My portion of the settlement was substantial enough that I was able to pay off my mortgage completely and still have money left over for investments. More importantly, the case led to changes in state law regarding HOA oversight and property seizure procedures. Legislators realized that existing laws weren't strong enough to prevent this kind of abuse, so they passed new regulations requiring judicial approval for any HOA liens or property actions. The new laws also established criminal penalties specifically for HOA board members who abuse their positions for personal gain. What the president did is now explicitly illegal under state law, not just federal law. Our neighborhood got a completely new HOA board after everything came out. The old board members who hadn't been directly involved in the president's schemes still resigned in shame. Nobody wanted to be associated with the corruption. The new board's first official act was to establish oversight procedures to prevent any future abuse. They also hired a professional property management company to handle day-to-day operations, taking power away from individual board members. Property values in the neighborhood actually went up after the scandal broke. Apparently, buyers like knowing that there are strong safeguards against HOA corruption, and the new oversight systems made our community more attractive to potential residents. I still live in the same house and I still travel for work, but now I have the best security system money can buy, and everyone in the neighborhood knows exactly what happens when someone tries to mess with my property. The president wanted to steal my house because she thought I'd never return or wouldn't be able to fight back from overseas. Instead, she ended up in federal prison while I got a free house renovation and enough settlement money to retire early if I wanted to. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting criminals be stupid enough to hang themselves with their own schemes. And that, finally, is the complete story of how my HOA tried to steal my house while I was abroad and how they ended up paying for it in ways they never imagined. I know this story is incredibly long, but I wanted to include all the details because the full scope of what happened was much bigger than just one corrupt HOA president trying to steal one house. It was a systematic criminal enterprise that affected multiple families across multiple states. The lesson here isn't just about standing up to HOA bullies, it's about the importance of documentation, legal representation, and never assuming that distance makes you powerless. The president thought geography was on her side. She figured I was too far away to stop her and too small to matter in the bigger scheme of things. She was wrong on both counts. If you're dealing with HOA problems, document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to escalate when someone crosses the line from annoying to criminal. And if you're thinking about serving on an HOA board, remember that the power comes with serious legal responsibilities. Abuse that power, and you might end up learning about federal prison from the inside. The next one is a malicious compliance story. In a previous role, I came across the epitome of manglement, a young twat who'd been smarmy enough to work his way into a leadership role, without ever having to actually do the job he was managing. Unsurprisingly, he was less than effective. To use his words, we were the skilled team that worked for him. He was in the management. There are a few stories I can share about this dick, including one where he said I was too attractive to do my job, but that's for another time. This particular anecdote was when the previous leader left, and we ended up with him. Our new leader was quite particular about his role. He wasn't just a leader, he was a production leader. He was quite insistent we called him by his job title, to the extent that he moaned when we said, "Oh, the gaffer says XYZ. Nope, it must be the production leader says XYZ. Please respect his job, thanks." I assume this was his pretentious effort to seem important. Remember I said he'd never worked the job before? He never quite understood the details of what he was asking, and you could see his eyes glaze over and his mind wander to KPIs and metrics whenever someone said, that won't work. We need to do ABC first before we throw this job onto the machines." For the most part, we just worked it out ourselves and did what we could and explained what we couldn't. More glazing over and thoughts of metrics and checkboxes followed. His general demeanor didn't really sit well with us, especially how he thought he was better than the grunts working the job. The one thing that sticks in my mind is that the previous boss, who had retired, used to say "our team." The new guy said "my team." Small difference, but it speaks volumes. So we decided to maliciously comply. You want to be called by your job title? Sure, we can do that. However, we abbreviate everything, including your job title, production leader, operations, that abbreviated to PL, ops. which abbreviated to Plops. I can't take credit for the nickname, but it spread super quick. The malicious compliance was embedded. Within 36 hours, every shift knew that we had to follow Plop's orders. For non-English speakers, plop is an onomatopoeic way of describing the act of passing feces. Plops was obviously quite unhappy with his new nickname. Just imagine the most nasally voice ever saying, "I am a production leader," to a group of guys, most of which had been in the trade since before Plops was born, and you've got a good idea of how well-respected Plops ended up being. For the rest of his short career in that role, we called him Plops. It infuriated him. To give you an example of a typical incident, 3 of the shop floor guys are stood in the middle of the factory talking. Plops sees this and walks over to chastise them for not working. Plops: "Excuse me, gents." Guy 1: "What's up, Plops?" Plops: "I'm a production leader. Why aren't you on your machines?" Guy 2: "We're trying to figure out how to do the job." Plops: "What? Aren't you trained for this?" Guy 1: "We are, Plops. Been doing this for 24 years. Plops: "But the..." Guy 2: "The problem is, Plops, we have 4 sets of tooling available. Each job requires 2 sets of tools per machine, and as there are 3 of us, we would need," pauses sarcastically to count, "6 sets of tools." Plops: "Nobody told me that." Guy 3: "Yes, because we normally split the job out by individual tasks. One can process the tasks that don't need tooling, then split the tasks between 2 and 3. It doesn't matter what order these are done in, so we split the batches 2 to 1, then swap. Do you have a better solution?" Plops: "No, do that." Guy 1: "Thanks for your advice, Plops." Plops walked away looking very red, with the guys bursting out laughing while still very much in earshot. Plops complained numerous times, and the chief of production told us off in a very half-arsed way. We later found out he also hated Plops for consistently bringing his nickname up and expecting something to be done, often telling him that this wasn't a school and to just play along and it'll naturally go away. Fast forward to one day when Plops was late for a site-wide meeting. He entered the room to be met with 2 or 3 voices chastising him with comments such as, "What time do you call this, Plops?" and "Good grief, it's Plops o'clock." Turning a now familiar shade of crimson, he opened his mouth, but then noticed the director of operations, DOPS, stood at the front, having paused his speech. Plops shut his mouth and quickly found a seat. The director continued for a bit before pausing to ask if anybody had any questions. Plops's hand immediately shot up. "Apologies for being late, but I had a question about the half-year business projections given the ramp-up in production. Was this already covered, or is this a good time to ask the question?" This question had absolutely nothing to do with anything we did, and it was painfully obvious Plops was just asking the question to seem even more pretentious than he normally was. The director replied, "Not a problem, Plops. Maybe save that one for the end." This was too much for everybody else, who burst out laughing. The director didn't know who Plops was and had assumed that was his name. The director innocently asked, "Oh, is that not his name?" Someone explained it was a nickname. He was called John. The director apologized, and Plops, presumably trying to hide his embarrassment, said, "Don't worry, it wasn't an important question." After the meeting, Plops excused himself and we didn't see him for the rest of the day. He was back in the following day with an even more sour face than normal. We were all still giddy about how the director had called him Plops, so we just gave him a wide berth. A few days later, when the atmosphere had calmed down, Plops announced at a meeting that he'd accepted a similar role at another site and would be transferring in the next week. We then found out that Plops had complained yet again, about a director no less, to the chief who had now got fed up of having to baby the kid, and had had a quiet word with the director. Said director, presumably wanting to save face a little, advised that another production lead at a different facility was going on maternity leave, so Plops could be parachuted into that role fairly easily. They then had the best part of a year to find somewhere else for him. We weren't sad to see Plops go, but he forgot to bring in cakes on his last day. So one of the guys who'd worked with some of the staff in the new facility made a phone call. From what I understand, Plops's outgoing counterpart introduced him at one of their morning meetings and invited him to speak. He said, "Good morning, I'm John, and I'll be taking over from Lisa while she's off. I am an experienced production leader, so I'm hoping we can keep the wheels turning whilst Lisa and I make the transition. wishing her the best with the baby and for new parent life. A chorus of voices came from across the room. Well said, Plops. We eventually got a new production leader who'd worked in a similar role at another company. He seemed to be a decent guy. At his first meeting, he introduced himself and brought in a crate of homemade samosas. He said he didn't want to intrude on our workstations unnecessarily, and thus asked everybody to pop into his office at some point in the next day or two to introduce themselves and have a 5 to 10 minute chat. I was nominated by the guys to go first and report back how he was. I summarized his personality with one observation before I'd even sat down. I walked over to the office door and knocked. He waved at me to come in, and as my gaze went upwards, I noticed the new sign he'd put on the door. Plop's office. The next one is an entitled People Story. This story takes place on Åland in southern Finland, and it also features all our favorite Russian dude Vladimir, obviously fake name. This story starts with 3 Russian dudes that had booked a 3-day fishing package with 4 nights of accommodation in a luxury beachfront villa and food for all 3 days. Basically all-inclusive fishing edition. As you may imagine, this was not a cheap experience. When we discussed the package, the question of alcohol consumption did come up, and I did inform them that a little bit is okay as long as nobody gets drunk to the point of it being a safety concern. It also says in the terms and conditions you have to approve when paying for the reservation. So they arrive and check in no problems. The fun starts the next day when they show up down at the dock to go out fishing the first day. 2 of the guys come in proper fishing gear with rods and equipment looking ready for a day of pike fishing, but Vladimir seems to have other priorities. He is holding a cooler in one hand and a large bottle of some kind or brown spirits in one hand. When I see this, I remind the group about the alcohol policy, and to this Vladimir laughs, uncorks the bottle, and starts chugging. He drinks the whole thing, standing right there on the pier in some weird show of dominance, I guess. While this is going on, I just stand there in my boat watching, trying to make sense of what is happening before me. Vladimir Friends doesn't seem too impressed with their friend making a scene the first thing in the morning. After finishing the whole bottle, he looks at me and says, "There, all done." So I'm guessing he thinks he can go on the tour as long as he doesn't drink all that while on the boat. Well, sorry Vladimir, but that's not how this works. You are not going on the boat today. Now, this was not the response Vladimir expected. He started of laughing, thinking it was a funny joke, but when I insisted and he realized I was not going to let him go on the boat today, he absolutely lost it. He screams and shouts in about equal parts English and what I assume is a long list of Russian profanities. He then says that if I don't let him on the boat, they will all go home and I will have to pay them back for the whole trip. Well, no, Mr. Vladimir, I will not pay you back. As clearly stated in the terms and conditions, the free cancellation is only until 7 days before the trips, and it very clearly states that the guide is free to prevent anyone from going on the boat, and that we may cancel a tour at any point with no refunds if guests get too drunk. You knew this, we told you, and you did approve the TOC. The accommodation is also 7 days free cancellation, so sure, I am not going to force you to do anything, but you are not getting any money back. He of course threatens with the usual, we will hear from his lawyers and he will call the police or whatever, who cares anyway. It's not like it's gonna work anyway. After a long and heated argument in Russian with his friends, Vladimir storms of, and his 2 friends come back to me and say they still want to go fishing. So if we go without Vladimir, as it turns out, Vladimir and the 2 other guys are childhood friends, and one of them is somehow related to Vladimir, like a cousin or something. And Vladimir is stinking rich. He is apparently a low-ranking government official in Moscow. He owns a yacht and stuff, and he paid for the whole trip for his friends. I do not see Vladimir for the 2 other days either, because apparently the booze is more important than fishing with his friends. The friends were perfectly nice and only had 1 beer each for lunch and dinner when out on the boat. We caught a lot of pikes, so I guess I have taken some ill-earned gains from a corrupt Russian official with a drinking problem. I later heard from a lady that works at the resort I had arranged accommodation for them at that Vladimir had tried to convince the receptionist and even the CEO of the hotel that I'm bad, they needed a refund, and that they should fire me. Only problem is I didn't work for the hotel to start with. They are only a business partner I buy accommodation from occasionally. Still waiting to hear from Vladimir's lawyer 8 years later. Anyway, thank you for watching.